Good afternoon. My name is Don Juan, and my guest today is Dr. Thomas. Welcome, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you.
Dr. Thomas, can you please tell us a little bit about your background?
I'll give you the quick version. Born in Havana, Cuba, raised here in Los Angeles, and both raised in Huntington Park, back from 1969 until much in the late 80s, and then we moved to Downey, and now I live in Houston, Texas. I have my degree in history at Biola University, a BA in La Mirada, and a master's degree from Cal State LA in medieval and Renaissance history, and I got my doctorate in medieval history at Claremont. And I teach. I've taught at Biola back, where I started, in the Torrey Honors Institute, which is a great books program, which means that I taught the whole history and cultural and intellectual history of the West, from Homer's Iliad to Flannery O'Connor. Mm-hmm. And I for the past 6 years, I've been teaching at Houston Baptist University, doing the same thing in their honors college, but also teaching medieval history for the history department there, and a little bit of Roman history as well.
And let me ask you, what made you major in history?
Well, I think what made me major in history is just simply discovering how much I loved it. Mm-hmm. And then reading C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image gave me a great love for medieval history and medieval literature. Mm-hmm. And when I was at Biola, my focus was modern European history, with a focus on NATO and the Warsaw Pact nations. Mm-hmm. And my ambition was to go into maybe being an analyst for the State Department or for the CIA. As a policy as an analyst, not as an agent, but as an analyst. I have to make that clear, because when I say CIA, people think, oh, agent, secret agent man. No. But then when I read C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, that just reignited my love for the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. So,
let me ask you this question, even though it's not part of the topic, but as we see more females going into this major, into history, which is a good thing.
Sure, absolutely.
But now, instead of saying history, they're saying herstory. What do you think of that?
There's a lot I could say about that, but it shows a great ignorance of what the nature of the language. For one thing, the word history is an anglicized word.
It has nothing to do with masculinity.
It has nothing to do with masculinity. So let's just get that out there, right? History is a Greek word. Mm-hmm. And you see it in Herodotus, in his major history, where he covers the Persian wars. Mm-hmm. And he says actually no, I'm sorry, not Herodotus, but Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War. He uses the word historia, but what historia means is inquiry.
But can we argue that history or his story has not been fair to the female gender?
But I don't think that's the fault of the word itself, mm-hmm. right? If you want to include more women's history, sure, fine, that's fine. But don't blame the don't blame the word for it,
right?
Right? Don't blame don't call it her story. It is because you're making whether you're doing women's history or whatever it is, you're still doing an inquiry, right? And I'm going to use that awful word, truth, which is a bad word.
Especially for Democrats.
Oh my goodness, truth. Did I just say a bad word? I said a naughty word. But it should be an inquiry into the truth.
Right. But so today's theme is let's talk about Islam in Spain. But just as a general question, and I believe you've been asked this before, why are Western historians so anti-West?
Well, I could There are a lot of factors that go into it, but if I had to really pick something that kind of unifies it all, it's a cultural Marxism that has taken control of our academic centers for the past several decades already. You know, this sort of in Western civilization, there's always been kind of a self-critical analysis, right? There's been and you can see this from the time of the Greeks and the Romans,
right? And
and the Jews too, in Jerusalem.
This is not a new American phenomenon of neo-Marxism in academia.
Yeah,
we've seen this in Latin America.
Oh, absolutely.
60s, 70s, 80s.
In the 60s, a lot.
Right, and it didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
So why are we now going that route if it didn't work for Latin America?
Well, because we tend to kind of like to think that we could do it better.
So, but in this particular case, we're not leading the Western world. We're followers of Latin America.
How dare you? First of all, how dare you observe the obvious? How dare you speak the truth? Bad person.
Yeah, bad person, right? Exactly. But
yes,
right.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, see, this is the thing. If it's sort of, it's kind of like the definition of madness, right? That
right.
People, a great definition is doing the same thing, hoping to get a different result.
Exactly.
If I keep banging my head on the wall, thinking that I'm going to cure my headache, right? I have a headache and I keep banging my head. Well, I'm going to just keep doing this until my headache's gone. Well, if I keep doing that, maybe it will be gone, but I'll be dead.
Exactly.
Right?
Right. And then,
but it's cured, my headache's gone.
And the following up question would be, why are Western historians so anti-Spanish?
Ah, yes. Well, you have to go back to the Black Legend. You ever heard of the Black Legend? No, it's not it's not some sort of frontier hero like Zorro. The Black Legend, right? No. The Black Legend is really an English concoction. It goes back to the colonial era. Now you remember Bartolomé de las Casas,
yes.
right? When he wrote his History of the Indies, and he was chronicling all the atrocities, some of the atrocities of the colonists.
Right.
His purpose was to appeal to the king.
Yes.
So that the king, who was the protector of his peoples, including the indigenous peoples, could take action, and but the English got a hold of it.
Now, in Latin America, Bartolomé de las Casas is known as the defender of the indigenous.
Yes.
Should Bartolomé de las Casas be canonized?
Well, I think if there are several miracles, canonization is dependent on several things.
Right, but would you consider that a miracle would be that because of him, we have Las Leyes de Burgos?
Yes.
And therefore, that could be considered a miracle on its own.
Las Leyes de Burgos, yeah, that could be. But also if somebody gets healed because they invoked his name, and if you get an answer to your prayer because you invoke the prayers of a saint, then it's evidence that saint is in heaven making his petition, his or her petition in heaven, and God hears them, right? God,
right.
And that means that they're in heaven. That's all it means, right? Canonized sainthood is basically that's basically what it means. That the person is. We know that the person. We have a very good assurance that the person is in heaven, right, in paradise.
Right.
So, should he be canon? Probably. And the thing is.
But would he be a Mexican saint or a Spanish saint?
He'd be both.
He'd be both.
Right. because he's shared by
A
both.
symbol of unity.
He's a symbol of Hispanidad.
Yes.
As a symbol of the unity of all of our peoples across the Atlantic. You know, the mother country, Spain, and her children, you know, from the Philippines down to Chile, right? He just like San Martin de Porres, and what's her name? The one from Saint Rosa de Lima is another one. She's both Spanish, but she's also Mexican, Peruvian, right?
Right.
Another person, though probably not going to, who's kind of like this, though her cause, I don't think she'll ever have a cause for canonization. I haven't heard, but Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. She's taken as a Mexican or a Chicana.
Right.
Some even try to say, no, she's none of the. She's actually, yeah, she could be called Mexican, but she could also be called Spanish, very Spanish.
And Sor Juana, this is another topic, but Sor Juana, she's not a feminist, she's not a socialist, and I hope they don't say that she's a Democrat. But she's everything else but Catholic.
Yeah, so she's everything else but exactly.
Right.
Just like Bartolomé de las Casas, he's appropriated by a lot of these groups, and he's everything but a Catholic bishop.
Exactly. And so going back.
And one more thing about Bartolomé de las Casas, he was actually the first he celebrated one of the first masses in Hispaniola with Columbus there. So he was not anti-Columbus.
Exactly. So going back to the point that, you know, we have Western historians that are anti-Spanish, and therefore let's talk about the year 711.
Yeah.
When you have
first, let me say something about the Black Legend. The Black Legend, when the English got a hold of Bartolomé de las Casas' book, they used it
and
twisted it and used it as propaganda against Catholicism,
which is still being used,
and it's still being used today. That legend is still making out the English to be the defenders of enlightenment and civilization, whereas the Spaniards are these backward Catholics. You see that in the dynamic between between the United States and Mexico and Latin America today.
Right.
You see that it really goes back to the Black Legend.
Right, and going back to the year, it's a crucial year, 711, when Islam crosses over to the Iberian Peninsula, and it stays there for 800 years.
Yeah.
To some historians, this is the golden age of Islam in Spain, which came to an end in 1492
Yes.
with the fall of Granada. Why is it that Western historians look at this Islamic period in Spain, right, and put it in this sort of pedestal?
Yeah, because, well, I think it also has to do with a combination of a Black Legend and cultural Marxism. When those two unite, you get a very potent, toxic poison, as it were.
Which is being fed in the academias to our students.
Yes. You know, because, yes, the Cordoban Caliphate was an incredible sort of, center of culture and medicine and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But it was it was only a united caliphate from about later on 750 for 300 years. 300 of those 800 years. Mm-hmm. After that, it split up. Mm-hmm. After the reign of Al-Mansur, into these little Taifa kingdoms, right? These little petty kingdoms, fragmented kingdoms, which were susceptible to attack not from the Christians necessarily, but from other Muslims coming up from the north, like the Almoravids, and later on the Almohads. So it was never quite the same again. The golden age was under the Caliphate. for 300 years.
Mhm.
That was the Islamic
So
golden age.
you would agree that Spain, Islamic Spain, did have its golden age.
It had it, yeah.
And did the Reconquista put an end to this?
No,
Why not?
because it fell because of its own, because its own center could not hold anymore. Because you had a very weak caliph. Al-Mansur was actually the caliph, the last real caliph of Cordoba. I forget his name, but he was a very weak teenager, kind of effeminate even, or at least that's what's said of him. So the real power behind the throne was the Emir Al-Mansur,
Right.
and he was powerful. But after him, there was no succession to really keep it all going, so it just fragmented into these little shattered kingdoms, these little petty kingdoms, and that was, and you had attempts to create a new center of, by the Almoravids, based on a very strict interpretation of Islam, I think his name was Mutamim, of the Almoravids on the one hand, and then, but you know what? The funny thing that would happen is when the Almoravids took over, after the first generation, they began to drink wine again.
Wine.
See, there's something about being in
Wine.
Spain. How could you be in Spain and not drink wine? Right?
Right.
And this was true of the Cordoban Caliphate. Everybody drank wine in the Cordoban Caliphate, right? Even the Caliph himself. And these petty little kingdoms, the kingdom of Saragossa and Granada and all these other places, all the kings of these Islamic kingdoms are drinking wine until the Almoravids come in.
They come in.
Once, and they ran, but then after a generation, no, this
Why
is pretty.
not?
And then the Almohads, same thing. They come in, they lay down the law, the Islamic law, but after a generation, their children are drinking wine.
Now, Thomas, let's talk about Cordoba.
Yes.
Let's talk about the cathedral in Cordoba.
Yes.
Cordoba Cathedral.
Yeah.
Is it a mosque or a cathedral?
Well, I could ask the same thing of the church. Did I say church? I'm sorry. The Hagia Sophia. Is that a church or is that a mosque? See, and I know where this question is going, I think, but ask it.
Well, should we do a trade-off?
Okay.
Should we give them the cathedral, now mosque, Cordoba, and let them give us Hagia Sophia? Is it a fair trade-off?
You know what? That is exactly the deal that I would offer them. Okay, smart guys. You want us to give you the cathedral of Cordoba? Fine, we'll give it to you. You give the Christians back Hagia Sophia. When that happens, then we'll talk.
My ideal solution would be for them to give us Hagia Sophia to the Catholic Church, and then us give it to the Greek Orthodox.
Yeah.
And maybe that would repair the great schism.
The great schism. From your mouth to God's ears. Yes.
Yes. Let me ask you: should there's a small sector of Spaniards that are converting to Islam because they're being told that their forefathers were they were Muslim, they were Islam, and especially if they're from southern Spain, and they want to pray inside of this cathedral in Cordoba. Should they be allowed to pray, us Muslims, inside of the cathedral?
The day that that Christians are allowed to pray inside the Hagia Sophia.
Then that day.
Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah.
Now, if the church would allow Muslims to pray in the cathedral, wouldn't she in a way be doing would she not come across as more tolerant, ecumenical, and do her penance.
And we should demand the same thing of the Turks in Constantinople. You know, if you go to Constantinople and you say a public prayer, let's say you do
Hail Mary,
or in the traditional Eastern Christian, the Trisagion, Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal, have mercy. Ooh, you'll be hauled off to jail. You'll be hauled off to jail.
But that is not reported in Western media.
Of course.
You know, what only is reported in Western media is how intolerant the Spanish Catholic Church is by not allowing Spanish Muslims.
But see, this is the difference. If a Muslim goes in there and starts to pray anyway, the only thing that will happen to him is he'll just be asked to leave.
Right.
If a Christian goes into the Hagia Sophia to pray publicly, he'll be hauled off to jail.
The difference.
There's the big difference.
Exactly. And one more question. La Reconquista. Is that Christian history?
Is that Christian history? To a certain degree, I think it is part of crusading history, certainly. And that's part of Christian history.
And should it be taught in a negative, shameful manner, or should it be taught in it was a good thing for Western history?
I think it should be taught truthfully, with the good and the bad. Right? Good and bad. Just like anything in history.
Right. You have winners, you have
winners, you have losers, you have some good guys, bad guys, some in between.
It's history.
It's history.
Right.
We should treat it as that, not trying to demonize the people that took part in it. It is.
You know, in history, people die.
People die in history.
know,
exactly.
But it seems we want to read history and not know one to die.
Well, the slave trade is sort of another issue. The two kind of related to this, because the way that you would read it today, it's as though the white man came, the white Westerner, European came and invaded peaceful, villages and just started taking blacks. That's not the way it happened at all. Actually, what happened was that you had the Kingdom of Mali in Africa, in North Central Africa, but that also broke apart, and you have these warring kingdoms now that are basically taking. They're the ones who are going into villages and also taking those taken in battle and selling them off to the Arab cities in northern Africa.
Right.
And they've been doing this for quite a bit now. Now, when the Tuaregs cut off their supply routes to these northern cities, well, they're the Europeans. They simply sold to the Europeans, but the Arabs were actually, the Muslims were actually the Muslims were taking part in these in this slave trade for a long time. And guess what? When the Europeans stopped, that didn't mean the end of the slave trade. No, and it continues to this day. A lot of people and this is not picked up by the Western media, a lot of African peoples are actually sold off as domestic workers to the Saudis.
Right.
By these very same groups of Muslims that have been taking part in the slave trade for centuries.
Right, and Islam was a big player in
absolutely.
Trade.
Absolutely. I mean, Muslim, they were Muslim peoples that were very much part of that slave trade.
Right.
And as they were supplying some of these to the northern African Arab cities.
No, two more questions, Dr. Thomas. Let's go back to this period between 711 and 1492. Muslim Spain. Were they Spaniards or were they Muslims? can this period be considered Muslim history or Spanish history or both?
Well, it's interesting because I think it's complicated.
It's a complicated
thing. I could say one or the other, but here's at least by the 15th century. If you heard a Jew and a Muslim talking to each other in, let's say, Granada, in the 14th century, let's say, you would hear both of them, and they would actually be speaking Spanish. They would actually be speaking some form of Spanish, Mozárabe or something. But the way their spoken language may have been a Hispanic, a Latin-based Hispanic language, but the way that they wrote it would be different.
Yes, I think it's Alcamiado.
Yeah, Arabic. The Muslim would be writing Spanish in a very Arabic characters, and the Jew would be writing it in Ladino, right? With Hebrew characters, right? That's why I think somebody discovered.
The unifying factor then would be la hispanidad.
La hispanidad.
Or la esencia, the essence.
The essence of hispanidad. Yes, I think that's true. But I think it's a complicated issue. I would say that it partakes of some aspects of Spanish culture. Arabic has contributed to our language.
Right.
A lot of words that we use, like
Ojalá,
inshallah, right? Sort of derived from Arabic, but I think essentially, for the longest time, I think Spanish culture, if you take it way back from the New Testament times, I think the constant has been Christianity. Spanish history has been more Christian history than it has been Islamic. And Islamic kind of comes into it. I mean, it has influenced our culture and our language to a great extent. But I think there's that constant there.
Right. And my last question. Can you be Hispanic and not Catholic? Can you be Hispanic?
Oh boy.
And Muslim? Can you be Hispanic and Protestant?
Yeah, I think if you were some other things other than Catholic, I think you'd be committed to things that have not been. I mean, I grew up a Baptist. I'll just take an example from my own life. My parents were Cuban Baptists. They had been baptized Catholics, but they became Baptists through the ministry of a Canadian Baptist mission. Now, growing up, I mean, a lot of our Cuban neighbors, a lot of our Cuban friends were Catholics, and I knew that there was something of there was a sense in which I knew I was Cuban. I knew I was kind of partaking of certain aspects of Cuban culture. But I also knew that there was something very different. Right? There was something very different. Because when they would talk about going to misa, ir a la misa, having your first communion.
Right.
Right? When are you going to have your first communion? Oh, you're not baptized yet because, Baptists believe in believers baptism.
Right.
When you're a little older. I wasn't baptized until I was 12.
Right.
So you're not baptized. So when I was talking to some of my Cuban, I had a circle of a lot of friends, Greeks, Russians, and, but even the Greeks, my very close Greek friends, the Pagolatos, this is Huntington Park back in the day when it was much more diverse than it is now. You know.
Yes.
And so, but they had been baptized as infants, right? And all these people, these Catholics and these Orthodox, and I felt like I was the odd man out.
Right.
Right. And very much. So I knew there was something that was kind of odd about me. Right. And I think I kind of had a sense that there's something very different, and also what came with it is a little bit of a buying into this sort of Anglo-American black legend about the history of Spain and the history. You know, what I had been fed was that, you know, that the English, you know, always the Pilgrims. Right, the Pilgrim Fathers came for religious liberty, and the Spaniards came for gold.
Right.
And all that mess. Right.
Right.
Of course, now I think that's rubbish.
Right.
But at the time, that's what I was being fed. So there was a certain self-hatred that came with it.
And we don't talk about this, but you know, when the Spanish when they made it to the Americas in 1492, they brought faith and reason.
Yes.
To the Americas.
The first universities,
right?
San Marcos, and also in Mexico, the Autónoma,
right?
That was a Catholic. You know, that at one time that was established as a very Catholic university.
Right.
Now, of course, it's something completely different.
Else. Exactly. Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for this interview.
My pleasure.
Thank you.